I'd like to welcome Saba Salman, who is a social affairs journalist in the UK. She has over 20 years experience and is currently a regular contributor to The Guardian. Saba, welcome.
Thanks, Quinn. Delighted to be here.
What drew you to journalism? How did you get involved in journalism?
I suppose I always enjoyed reading and writing as a child, so I always liked writing short stories. But there were two teachers at school in particular who were really great at encouraging all sorts of different writing, from short stories to news reports. So I think that was an influence. And I grew up in the 1980s, and we only had 3 or 4 channels then. But on one of the channels, there was a war correspondent called Kate Adie, who worked for the BBC. And I watched her news reports. Didn't want to become a war correspondent, but it showed the impact of good reporting and telling people stories. So I think it was probably a combination of those two. And always being quite a nosy child, I think, inquisitive.
Was there a specific teacher or an experience that drew you to journalism that got you interested?
I think I had 2 really great teachers who encouraged imaginative writing, but also allowed you to experiment with different sorts of writing. So I suppose it was them. I don't think there was a particular experience in terms of something I saw, something specifically I wrote, but it was a combination of loving writing and loving to ask questions and realising that there was actually a job I could do where I could actually get paid to meet interesting people, write and ask questions. So it seemed great.
What does a social affairs like you write about?
I think that's a really great question, because so often we assume people know what this means, and it really made me think when you said that. What is it that I write about? I suppose it's the aspects of life that make a good society. So it's what makes a healthy, strong society. In terms of public services, that's healthcare, it's education, it's welfare, it's social security, it's public housing, and it's how all of those hang together to support people to live in our communities. And over in the UK, one of the first social affairs correspondents, I remember reading his words about his field a few years ago. He described social affairs journalism as a very challenging specialism, and you had to have a hard nose and a soft heart. So you've got to get those the right way around. But that was for me really summed up what it means to cover this sort of brief. But it's the things that mean that matter in life that hold us together, I think.
Can you go into a little bit more detail on what really kind of inspired you to cover the subject of learning differences, as I like to call it?
Sure, and I love that definition. I like how on Friends of Quinn you scroll out the disabilities phrase differences, because it really is about having a more of a level playing field and defining people in terms of what they can do rather than in terms of what they can't. I have a younger sister, Rana, who has a learning disability. So she's 26 now, and she has something called Fragile X syndrome, which I think you cover on Friends of Quinn as well.
I covered a little bit on it. I know my godmother actually has a son with Fragile X.
Right, yeah. Right. And I think there's a story on the site.
Yeah.
Referring to that, I read it. Yes.
Yeah.
So she has Fragile X syndrome, which is, as you know, is sometimes misdiagnosed as autism, but it affects her sensitivity to noise. She has communication issues, some behavioural issues, attention and concentration span, and she has a moderate learning disability. So she has inspired me to look more into that area of rights, really, and her growing independence and confidence as a young woman over the years has really inspired me to carry on writing, I guess, in that area.
Sure. What stories have inspired you that you've covered?
It's really hard to pick just one. I'm glad you've already asked about my sister, because very tempting there to mention her, even though I'm biased. The most inspiring stories, I think, are where extraordinary people do ordinary things. So, for example, I met a teenager with autism who stood up in front of a school and gave a speech about how he had gained independence, or perhaps it was the actor with Down syndrome that starred in her first theatre show. So it's really people doing the kinds of things, people with disabilities doing the kind of things that people without disabilities take for granted.
So you've been a journalist for over 20 years and are currently freelance at The Guardian in the UK. We have found you are... we have found you... I'm having trouble reading this, sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
We have... You've... I guess there's a
I know
error there, typo.
Sure.
What are the biggest issues that people face with learning disabilities in the UK?
Sure. I think the really obvious one here is funding. So the money, public funding for support is dwindling. Mm-hmm. And that comes at a time, because of austerity measures, that there's less money for support services. But that also comes at a time that we've got a huge amount of welfare reform. So we have something of a perfect storm. We have money for support being reduced at the same time that the support that exists is harder to access. So that's the first big problem. And I suppose I'm basing that on what I've seen, but also what people who know far more than me have explained. The other big one is cultural attitudes to disability and the lack of equal rights. And a combination of those two, I think, are the biggest issues that we have.
What needs to be done in the realm of equal opportunities for people with learning disabilities, do you think?
I think there's a huge amount left to do. I think, as you found in the States as well, that over the last 20 years, there's been a huge amount of progress in terms of equal rights, and there's less discrimination. And actually this year is the 20th year of the Disability Discrimination Act over here in the UK, which has had an impact on awareness. But there's still a huge amount left to do. I don't think people with learning disabilities are seen as equal citizens in our society. You don't see people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, for example, out and about in our communities. We've got 1 million people in the UK with a learning disability who can vote. Politicians just ignore them, most politicians, I should say. So I think that's a problem. Families of people with disabilities are quite often seen as a nuisance when they push for support. You asked about what more needs to be done. I think it's perhaps there's something around training politicians and policymakers to actually speak directly to people with learning disabilities rather than just the charities that support them, or rather than just reading the articles by people like me. So I think that's quite a big one.
What is your advice to young people with learning disabilities who want to pursue a career in journalism?
I think it's the same as it would be for anybody who wants to pursue a career in journalism. I think at the moment, you and I will both have seen the rise of citizen journalism and the rise of social media and what that can harness, blogging and all sorts of online platforms for getting your voice broadcast and getting your words read. So I think it would be self-publishing. It would be really using social media to connect with other people, other campaigners, other writers, and probably harassing people like me to listen more directly to the voice of people with learning disabilities. So it's a fine line, I think, with what I do sometimes. I can write someone's story, but I'm still, while I'm drawing attention to it, I'm still, in a sense, filtering their voice, whereas it's far stronger to hear from them directly.
From your investigations, what role does online media and the internet play in the learning disability community?
Sure. Huge role. Massive. I think it allows more platforms for change. Over here, we have various campaigns from disability rights groups and families and people with disabilities themselves, so self-advocates. And they've really harnessed things like Twitter and blogging and all sorts of the myriad of other platforms out there. One group that I've written about is called the Justice for LB campaign. I don't know if you've come across them.
No.
But LB was a nickname of a young man called Connor Sparrowhawk, who died when he was 18. He was in an NHS unit, in a health unit. And actually there's a jury inquest at the moment into his death. But the campaign that's linked to his story and his experience has really shown the power of grassroots social media campaigning. So that's one example that I think shows what you can do with online media. I wrote recently about a group called Digi, which was a weekend-long collaborative arts campaign to raise awareness about disability and learning disability. And this used technology and tech, digital technology, to create all sorts of amazing things in a town in the southeast, from art installations to dance and drama performances, and that was to raise awareness and visibility of people with disabilities. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to use social media for people who campaign on rights.
Well, it seems social media can really just change people's lives just instantly, almost, if you do it the right way.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think the trick is to harness the power, the potential of social media, but to make sure it goes offline as well, because you need to have that tangible change and make sure that you understand where it sits in the wider context, I suppose, of campaigning.
Can you share some more about the Spring Digi Festival, which you covered this past summer?
Sure.
I can barely say that word.
Sprung Digi, yes.
That has nothing to do with my dyslexia, it's just me being American.
So Sprung Digi, this was a group of artists with and without learning disabilities who did months of art workshops culminating in a weekend-long festival to raise awareness about learning disability and get people to really almost reconfigure a town centre. So by that I mean they had an art project to make maps of a local town centre called Horsham, which isn't too far from where I live, and involve people in using technology and seeing the power of technology to really reshape people's attitudes to disability. It was a very exciting project to be able to write about.
Well, Saba, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being able to do this interview with me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me.